We're going to fly to San Diego, buy cars for less than $2,500 each.
Well, it looks ridiculous.
George, it's a Bumblebee. So it mostly works, it runs well.
You've bought an Alfa.
I bought an Alfa
You've
Romeo.
bought an Alfa Romeo Spider.
We had a hot start problem. Alright, so we just replaced it.
But driving over such an iconic bridge was a really cool experience.
It was the Oregon border. We had no idea what was in store for us, and really that was part of the adventure.
We didn't really see a whole lot of Coos Bay. We got in super late the night before, and then we had to get up pretty early to make our 11 o'clock checkout. Evan and I got up and had a nice coffee on the porch and watched the tide roll out. I actually saw seagulls hunting, which is something I'd never seen before. I thought seagulls were just beach chickens that took a shit on everything in sight. These seagulls would, dive bomb crabs on the beach and then pick them apart right in front of us, and it was brutal, and it was actually really fun to watch.
This was also the morning we had a bit of an epiphany. George waking up in the morning is like watching someone go through all 5 stages of grief. Well, maybe not acceptance.
We packed up and did our morning fluids check, and none of the cars looked like they were going to explode, so we hit the road. We headed out of town through the main road and stopped at the first diner we came across, called Mom's. And Mom was serving. She was very interested in all the things that we were doing and the places that we'd been and where we were headed. We got back on the 101 and headed up the coast.
That's when we crossed the Conde McCullough Memorial Bridge. He designed most of the major bridges on the 101 through Oregon. They're all gorgeous, and we'll cross most of them today.
It was beautiful, but it was much more cloud cover and rocky than California had been.
Having finished up Highway 1 in California, I was a little worried that the rest of the drive wasn't gonna compare. The Oregon coast was a lot different, but it was still great. We'd left behind most of the crazy twisting and turning, but we'd also left behind the heat and most of the crazy traffic. The views were still impressive, and for whatever reason, Oregon seems to have, the coolest bridges.
Thanks, Conde. That was one of his, the Big Creek Bridge, which is also identical to one of the 2 that we skipped. He was part of a new breed of early 20th century engineer, college-educated, a believer in an integrated highway system, and committed to building efficiently, economically, and aesthetically.
Our stop for the day was going to be Thor's Well in Cape Perpetua, which was a couple hours north of Coos Bay.
Since day 1, before anyone but George even had a car, and Bumbles had his first breakdown, George has been in the habit of trying to start the Bumblebee right after he stops, just to see. Since the starter replacement in LA, this has been mostly unnecessary.
And sure enough, we stopped at Thor's Well, ready to get out and take a look at all the pretty things, and the first thing he radios back is that the Bumblebee won't start.
Try it one more time. Actually, there's a couple other things.
I actually felt kind of bad. All these tourists were trying to be so helpful, and they offered jumper cables, or people, this thing's dead, and we gotta pay our respects and move on and stop offering jumper cables. Finally, we were able to convince George that let the hot restart issue do its thing and cool down, and we should go see what we stopped to see in the first place. Thor's Well was really, really cool. It was this area of volcanic rock that you could walk out on, and it was so much fun to watch all of the waves hit the edge of the rocks, and it would shoot up like geysers everywhere.
There's 2 major features in this part of Cape Perpetua. This one's called the Devil's Churn. When the waves hit it just right, the noise sounds like a huge thunderclap. Although Evan preferred Thor's Well itself and Taylor spent much of his time shooting the rocky basalt, I could have sat entranced by the Devil's Churn all day. Thor's Well, on the other hand, looked for all the world like a big hole in the ground. Until a wave rolled in under the rock, turning it into an otherworldly, bubbling pool of pristine seawater. A ways away, there's supposed to be another feature called the Spouting Horn, which can supposedly shoot seawater up over 50 feet in the air during rough seas. This definitely turned out to be one of our best stops on the trip, and we almost skipped it, since we couldn't figure out where it was supposed to be from the highway. My breakdown kept us in place long enough to make the hike and discover that somehow we'd found just what we were looking for and more.
After we finished up touristing, we returned to find that Bumble still wasn't starting. At this point, the Bumblebee had had more than its fair share of breakdowns, but never one this bad. We'd known something like this could happen, but we'd all made it so far, we thought we were in the clear. What were we gonna do? Back on the road, we pointed our cars north, determined to make up for lost time and not have any more delays. That lasted until the next town, where we encountered something very unusual. Due to some unique laws, we had to wait around for someone else to pump our gas.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, sorry. First time in the port.
Yep, a little different.
That rather odd experience over, we continued on towards Portland. The cars were still working well as we drove deeper into Oregon, and as we began to leave the coast behind in our jog inland, the weather and scenery started to look decidedly more northwest. But oddly, we didn't encounter any rain, and the trials of what we were calling Death Road in California fresh in our minds, we managed to handle the misty conditions without incident. As night fell over our little convoy, we were in the mountains again, this time sans ocean, and silence fell over the radios as we each enjoyed the scenery, weather, and our cars.
And we didn't really stop again at all during the day, except for a couple little fuel stops or rest stops here and there, until we reached Portland, and we drove straight through the middle of town, which was pretty beautiful to see. And then we took the highway up to Tomahawk Island, which sits in the middle of the Columbia River. We stopped at the Tomahawk Bay Marina and met our host Ashley in the parking lot, and she was just as interested in the three of us arriving in 3 separate vehicles as we were interested in the fact that she lives on a boat and that the Airbnbs that she rents out are also boats.
And the sign said, long-haired freaky people need not apply.
And she showed us around and then gave us a tour down the ramp into the boat and gave us a remarkably thorough demonstration of how to use the boat toilet. And then she set us loose on the island.
As there wasn't really anything that could be done with the cars, for the first time since this trip started, we actually got to spend one of these beach days exploring the city. Despite the danger of being stranded, we set out in the Bumblebee, as it was the only one of our cars that could seat 4.
We had time for maybe 2 touristy outings, and we headed downtown because we had little choice but to make the first the legendary Powell's City of Books. We were disappointed to discover that Powell's Technical had since been merged into the main store, but we soldiered on. Afterwards, we decided to make the second the Japanese Garden in Washington Park.
So far, all of the parks and beaches that we've been to were kind of overgrown nature and as undisturbed looking as possible. But the Japanese Garden is manicured and cultivated. And so you could tell that this is something that, as plain and simple as so many of the elements looked, that it took unbelievable care to keep them that way.
The 5.5-acre Portland Japanese garden is widely considered to be one of the finest outside of Japan, and Portland was treating us to a fabulous sunny day for a tranquil stroll through the park and a great view of the mountain. Happily, our visit fell on the last day before the garden closed for an extensive 3-acre, $30 million expansion. So I think we picked pretty well.
On the way out of town, something not entirely surprising happened. The bumblebee wouldn't start. After the usual amount of fiddling, George got it started and we were on our way.
Our drive up from Portland took us back towards 101 through a whole bunch of small towns, and it was very beautiful to drive through, but also fun to get back on the small town roads that I had come to really appreciate. The last city on our way out of Oregon was Astoria, and it's a small town that has a boardwalk right along the edge of the water. And after a frightful battle trying to find a place to parallel park, we stopped at this great little restaurant called the Colombian Cafe. I never would have thought that traveling so far north would have been required for such fantastic Cajun food, but I gotta admit, the food was absolutely incredible.
Shortly thereafter, we tried to get on our way again.
Sorry, George, I just got on. Can you say again?
Still not starting. Temperature is close to where it started at last time, so it shouldn't be too much longer. Well, that manifold's cooling down in a hurry, at least. Maybe I should have parked with the hood open. All right, I'm started. Waiting on traffic and another car to unpark, and then I'll be on my way.
Okay.
Turn right onto US 101 North.
After lunch, we got back on the highway and headed over the Astoria-Megler Bridge into Washington.
The last bridge in Oregon, which spans the Columbia into Washington state. It has a striking cantilevered section, and its construction in the 1960s at last completed US 101 as an unbroken route from Mexico to Canada. In some ways, then, this bridge is the keystone of our road trip.
We learned it's the longest continuous truss bridge in North America. It's over 4 miles long, and according to our dash cam footage, it took us a total of 8 minutes to cross it.
We were less than 300 miles from the Canadian border. At the time, it was all excitement for Washington, but looking back, it's bittersweet. In a very real sense, this was the last leg of the trip.
All right, gentlemen, we made it to Washington. All 3 cars.
1,750 miles.
And then we were in Washington, and everything in Washington is depressingly named. We took 401, a bypass off the 101, to skip Cape Disappointment, which took us along the stunningly beautiful Dismal Niche instead. I swear, I could not make this up if I tried. This is the names that the people in Washington have for their coastline.
The bypass we took only saved us a few minutes and shaved off a beautiful part of the 101, but hindsight is bullshit, and this drive was beautiful too. My mom recently moved back to Washington, but only after we'd planned the trip. So sadly, we only got to hang out with her for a few hours, touring Capitol Lake and then eating some more seafood at an old family haunt. And then it was back to the 101 for us, headed to Indianola.
Yet again, it was nearly midnight before we reached our final destination, Evan's old family home on the Sound in Indianola. Built in the early 1930s, it is dark and creaky, the windows rattle, and it is tremendously frightening. This place creeped me out. George and I were both seized with a sense of the call is coming from inside the house. The morning light revealed that the house was exactly what I thought it was. A beautiful old place perched dramatically on a cliff overlooking the Sound.
The house in Indianola is essentially an old beach cabin with about 1 million additions. The whole area is a fixture of my childhood memories, with a seemingly forever long dock.
Shall we mosey to the beach?
Sure. Massive tide flats, and a cute little corner store. This is the first time I'd been back in many years, and it did not disappoint. We spent the early afternoon dicking around on the beach and the dock, and then headed back to the house via the spider-infested trail up the bank. Our plan was to take some stock footage of the cars for use in the video. We didn't get very far for a pretty predictable reason.
We stopped to do some flybys, but then the bumblebee wouldn't start.
Luckily, the hot start fix was delivered earlier in the day. So George got to work, and Taylor and I decided to help in the best way we knew how. Eventually, George reported that he was ready to give the fix a try.
Well, don't record it.
George, this is where you get out of the car and shout, I mended something!
I mended something!
Bumblebee mended, we did our flybys.
I did not notice that spider. Where's there? This house is made of spiders. Where are we?
And then we traveled back in time and space to San Diego, let's say. Fabulous San Diego.
This really looks like San Diego to you.
Yeah. And then had a well-deserved cocktail, some dinner, and called it a night.
We topped off fluids, cleaned off the dew, and prepared our cars for the final leg of the journey.
Our stop for the day, and the last stop of the road trip, was Hurricane Ridge,
just outside of Port Angeles,
deep in Olympic National Park.
At the top, we would be 1 mile in the air and almost 1,800 miles from our starting point in San Diego.
Though not, strictly speaking, the last thing we planned to do on this trip,
Hurricane Ridge was very much the finishing point of this crazy bourbon and Top Gear fueled journey.
One final climb,
one final road,
one final hurdle
for our broken,
abused,
neglected scrap heaps
to finish.
For all 6 of us,
3 cars and their men
could claim victory.
Winding up the mountain, the road was great, the cars were running, and the weather was mild.
The road threaded up the mountain and treated us to pristine mountain views and a surprising amount of occasionally suicidal wildlife. And then,
suddenly,
we were at the top.
1,861 miles ish.
5,242 feet up.
Many quarts of oil,
A gallon or so of coolant,
pinch of transmission fluid,
5 dash cams,
2 cameras.
3 cars.
and 3 useless humans. We made it.
We made it.
We made it. Victory in hand, we futzed with the cars, explored the visitors center a bit, and of course took a ton of family photos of the cars. And then we went on which was a mostly little hike. In actuality, aside from forcing our cars to stay between some lines without any power steering, this was by far the most physical activity any of us had done in a while. So, with us huffing and blowing and Taylor accidentally inhaling a bug, it appears that we too were neglected scrap heaps. From the top of Hurricane Ridge, we could see mountain range after mountain range. We could see Port Angeles, where we just had lunch a few hours before. We could see Victoria, where we were going to have lunch except for ferries to Canada are crazy expensive for some reason. And we could see one curiously yellow spot off in the woods. Eventually, we made our way back down, which was decidedly easier, futzed with the cars some more, and then headed down the mountain.
What do you desire? What makes you itch? What sort of a situation would you like? Let's suppose I do this often in vocational guidance of students. They come to me and say, well, we're getting out of college and we have the faintest idea what we want to do. So I always ask the question, what would you like to do if money were no object? How would you really enjoy spending your life?
Unlike any other trip any of us has ever been on,
These cars were so much more than just mindless, soulless transport.
Not only did they carry us through some of the best scenery and along the best driving roads we've ever seen,
they did so with style,
character,
and determination. So how does one summarize this trip?
How does one summarize this trip? It was
by far
the most monumentally stupid thing
any of us has ever done.
Ruinously expensive.
Potentially fatal.
And totally
100%
absolutely
worth it.
Worth it.
None of us would give up this experience.
Would give up
None of
this
us would give up
experience
this experience
for
for the world.
Thank you very much for watching. Good night.
You quote Top Gear too much.